as a medievalist and what I work on, but also as a literary critic, one of the things that I've found that's really fascinating about the discussion so far is the prevalence of narrative as a term of art that we've had over the last 2 days.
Right. When we think about the 2010s, there's a proliferation of new technologies that we might not think about, but that are equally important, and they lurk in the background of these stories. They're very, well, they're either very sexy or unsexy technologies, depending on how you speak about them, and they look very different from the image of Jesse Pinkman in an RV, or even Walter White's nicer. Actually, they look closer to Walter White's nice lab in the basement that he gets sometime during the third or fourth season. They are things like, actually it's two in particular. Bitcoin, digital currency transfer is very important. That's something that links consumers and producers, and it's something that we've seen in the last couple of years as one of the modalities for transferring cash internationally. The other thing that's important is something that came out of supply chain management and related things. It's this agile manufacturing. It means that laboratories that are creating fentanyl, carfentanil in China can adapt very quickly to the demands of the markets in the state. It's a very grim but very effective concordance between demand in the states tied to specific locations that are the entrepôts and the production sites, which are increasingly now in China.
I do think, if you think about this as drug-centric, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't be doing all the things that we're doing around this kinds of issue, it really doesn't get to root cause issues, right? And this is what you're getting at in terms of, substance use is pretty endemic in our culture. And why is that? And I think it's fundamentally, and I put this in the context of life expectancy in the United States is going down, right? No other Western country is seeing this. And it's largely attributable to drug overdose deaths, suicides, and diseases related to alcohol use disorder. I'm not an epidemiologist, but something fundamentally is going wrong with our culture, that people are dying of these diseases of despair, right? And there's been a lot written about people's economic circumstances, and I think it's far deeper than that, right? How do we think about issues like social isolation, people's connection to each other and connection to community? Connection and faith in social and faith institutions has completely eroded. Certainly things like poverty and racism play a huge role. So I actually think you're absolutely right that when we focus on the drug, and all of our solutions are about minimizing the supply and the burden of that drug, that we completely miss what the circumstances are that prompt people in the first place to use them.
So from what I have heard this name for the last couple of days, substance abuse disorder narratives are testaments. They're basically, they inform and function. They testify or bear witness to the experience of addiction or recovery. They are not only in this, because they are these testamentary in their form, they don't just describe what has happened or is happening. They also actively and proactively ask or demand something of us, the reader or spectator.
The Wire is often cited, the series The Wire, whatever it was, 6 seasons, and as something that really explored all the societal things, but through individual characters. And one of the things that hardly ever gets talked about that was sort of meaningful to me just because of my work is that by the end of it, when it sort of feels like everything has collapsed, just the rottenness of everything that is creating contemporary poverty in Baltimore has been exposed, you have this character with opioid use disorder, Bubbles, and he's sort of left at the bottom, but he's in NA, and he's in a group, and he's got a sponsor, and they're sort of left in the rubble to rebuild somehow community. They don't have the resources to do it in any kind of influential way, but they're doing it, and there's even a moment when a journalist finds out about Bubbles and wants to tell his story in the Baltimore Sun, and Bubbles refuses because you can tell I can't remember what his line is, but A, he says, there's a lot of other people doing what I'm doing, I'm not special, and B, he says, he basically says, he's going to tell it in a way that serves his needs, not mine, not ours. There's going to be something exploitative about it. And so it was just a really brilliant way in which it not only sort of told a big, grand narrative that did shift that locus of control, but it even exposed, as it was doing it, the ways in which narrative, that those same narratives get exploited all the time. So it's really fraught, but there are people who, I think, the way that Susan talks about David Foster Wallace's work too, about just many multiple voices, contributing to the same narrative is another strategy. These are all sort of, ways drawn from the humanities.
I think we have very different views of narrative, and I would say that mine, probably not surprisingly, might be closest to Owen's. I mean, I heard a lot of suspiciousness about what happens to narratives, when they go out into the world, from your paper, and a strong sense of the susceptibility of narrative to exploitation and misappropriation. So, I do think that Wallace writes with that kind of understanding. I mean, I think there's always this sense of, I'm playing with you, I'm manipulating you because I expect you to manipulate my portrait. And I think he understands language that way too. I do think there's a joyousness in his vision and in his writing. And I think that joyousness has to do in part with the recognition of, certain fundamental similarities that are very human. And one of these for him is, a lot of these qualities. I mean, this idea that all of us believe, I mean, it's a profound insight. All of us believe that we're unique.
I do think that restoring choice in the lives of folks who have substance use disorder that come into acute care is really important, and I contrast it with end-of-life consults, where we'll have like all these, they're dying, I mean, for sure, okay? We don't know exactly when. Prognostication in the ICU is not a fine science, but we have these conversations, and we talk about how do you want your last few months to go? And the medical treatments are in the context of a whole life. What do you like? Do you want to be at your camp when you die? Do you want to be with your family in Florida? Do you want to be able to go fishing one last time, et cetera? And it just strikes me when we have a consult with a patient where substance use disorder is really central, we don't talk about their lives. And so the case that I shared, Alyssa, who was 24, was discharged in February of 2015. She did have her surgery. It was in Portland, and she relapsed, and she died in January, a few weeks after her 25th birthday. And I remembered reading her obituary, and as a Native American woman, she was beadworking is an important part of that culture in my part of Maine, and she was apparently a master beadworker and did a lot of very creative artistic pursuits, and I learned all kinds of things about her that I hadn't learned in the encounter in the hospitals.
I think the critique on the U.S. side is much more around the fact that we have a pretty savage culture. I mean, we, for whatever set of reasons, have tolerated everything from genocide to severe racism to a level of murder on a daily basis in this country through guns that, frankly, no other country in the world will tolerate. We have a level of income inequality now which is reaching really kind of epic proportions. And we have responded to that by, a set of, and we're, are among the world's, greatest consumers of, pharmaceuticals, particularly illegal pharmaceuticals. So, at some point, this party is going to come to an end.
We're helping take the load off of the line officers, but mainly it's just law enforcement across the country are tired. Really, really tired. I mean, and they're beginning to realize that that they need help, and it's not coming. So they're going to do it themselves, but it's not sustainable long term, and they're just basically trying. It really has to do with breaking down the barriers of the stigma, because police were the first to admit they thought these folks were all junkies, and now it's their brothers, their sisters, their kids, their nieces, and their nephews. So, it's finally taken that long. So it's, the barriers are breaking down.